so much for being here. We will have a question and answer session at the end, but that's not to keep you from joining in. But let me ask, first of all, I have a rough idea. Us three were at the first meeting to form the association for February 11th. That was a Saturday, 1996. And Bill's brother, Al Diekman, from the vintage baseball program at Old Bethpage Village on Long Island, was also there. But there's at least, I'm aware of some people in this room who were at that first meeting, but please raise your hand or stand up if you were at that first meeting. Don and Marilyn Anderson, Big Bad Anderson, Muffin Icon, was historian for the association that first year. Anyway, we're glad to be here. We have some things planned, and Mr. Tootle was good enough to give you a handout, timeline. So to start, here you are. If anyone doesn't have one, just let us know. If Mr. Tootle will start, and we'll rather have a discussion. We have some points we want to make, but you have some points you want to make too at the end, or so forth. Is this good? Okay. Mr. Tootle?
Hey.
Jim Tootle started with the Muffins in '91, did a lot of work towards forming the association.
Well, didn't we all back then? Okay. And the best thing about it is seeing old friends that were there at the beginning or shortly thereafter that we've known since the 90s. And the next best thing is seeing the new faces, which means the organization has succeeded. And it's lasted 27 years, and here we are having a nice conference and more teams by far than there ever were back in '96 as it spreads to Florida and Arizona, California, and throughout the Midwest and the East Coast, and we have all these teams. Now, I'm not going to read all this to you, don't worry, but I wanted to give you a timeline as to give you some understanding of how all this started. And if we go back, you know, the Muffins have always had winter meetings that we used to call them, or winter seminars. We get all our returning players, new players, umpires, interpreters, scorekeepers, all that kind of thing. Have some speakers come in, like this meeting, talk about period dress, and rules, and uniforms, and how to make a ball, and all these kind of things. We've been doing that. That drew other clubs, wanted to come in and sit in on some of these things. Fine. Doug was team manager of the Muffins. Oh, I'm sorry. Team manager, Muffins, yeah. Doug was team manager of the Muffins at that time, an employee of OHS, and part of his responsibilities were to oversee the Muffins. Okay. Now, and planned all those meetings, which have continued on. But that's kind of where, you know, there wasn't any certain day that we started talking about this. It just sort of developed. But winter meetings, we found references in later discussions that, oh, I remember we started talking about this at the winter meetings in '95. And perhaps before that. I wouldn't be surprised at all if somebody remembers, oh, we talked about that in '93 or '94, whatever. But anyway, we'll go back to that. June, things really took off. June of '95, we were at the Sabre convention, and those are, remember, we got to play a vintage game right out on Three Rivers Stadium, right after the Padres and Pirates got through. We went out, and some of the major league players actually stuck around and said, hey, who are you guys? What are you doing? And they wanted to see our bats and all that stuff. So that was fun. But it was that was another occasion where a lot of people got together and started talking about, well, we ought to have a formal group of some kind. In August of '95, John Hussman, who was really instrumental in all this, president of the Sylvania Great Black Swamp Frogs, one of the founding teams and a real strong program all these years, kind of took the leadership along with Doug to get the ball rolling on actually doing something about this. And so he, with the Ohio Cup coming up on Labor Day weekend, and knowing a lot of vintage players and clubs would be there, that'd be a good time that we could get together and talk about this more. So we had a meeting kind of in the middle of the day, 12 or 1 o'clock, something like that, and we tried, people were playing and they're running around and everything, but we tried to get kind of a group together in one place at one time and start to talk about these things. So we had a nice meeting there on September 3rd of '95, and we had 7 clubs that were able to shake free of their playing right then and get a couple representatives together around the table to talk about this. Then we decided at that point to create a mission statement for this proposed group. And we had a committee of 3, and I was part of that group, to try to come up with a mission statement. And we did, and we were kind of under a timeline on that, because it's no random date that came out on September 23rd, 1995. We were shooting for that particular day, 150th anniversary of the founding of the Knickerbocker Club. And we thought, well, that's the day to bring this out and express our intentions and what this group would be all about. There's a copy of the mission statement in your handout there, by the way, if you want to look at it as we're talking about all this stuff. December, John Hussman sent out another notice, and I say John sends these things out. John and Doug worked on the planning of all this, inviting clubs to proceed and have a formal meeting. And then sent out a notice on January 11th, inviting all the known clubs of the time that we know about and were around to come to the Ohio Historical Society, which Doug had arranged with his staff and supervisor, that we, OHS at that time, not OHC, would be the host. And we would have a meeting that took up most of the day with the lunch in the middle, and we would get down to brass tacks on getting it started. So the first part is Doug, as the founding president is the term I like to use. Doug is too modest to use that, but any organization that starts has to have somebody that takes charge to get the thing together. And so Doug fulfilled that role, whatever you want to call it, and presided for the first part of the meeting, as he must do. And the Constitution was presented, debated, edited a little bit here and there, but we got it approved and adopted along with the mission statement that everybody was in agreement. We talked about the name. Should it be old-time baseball? Should it be historic baseball? Vintage had been kind of floating around as a term. We all agreed on that. Should it be the National Vintage Baseball Association? No, there's a team in Canada. We ought to include and not exclude anybody. Should it be only 1860? No, let's try to include everybody. But we wanted to keep it gentlemanly and sportsmanlike. If we go to 1880s, 90s, there was a 1922 Giants team. Well, if you get into that era, we all know there's fights, arguments, kill the umpire. It's just a rougher game that we really can't present in a family thing. Fast pitch, fighting and all that. So, we said those teams can do that. But let's keep it gentlemanly. Let's keep it sportsmanlike, and particularly in our off-the-field things and our interactions with each other as we talk about things. And let's be respectful, cordial, sportsmanlike in everything we do, on and off the field. Okay, so we get up here to February 11th, 1996, And that was the day, as Doug mentioned, kind of the magic day. The clubs came together. Invitation was sent out ahead of time. Are you interested? Would you like to join? Whatever. Can you send a representative? And others, although we had the founding clubs there that came to the meeting, there were others that joined at that time, but they just for one reason or other couldn't send a representative to the vote. But okay, so they came. Doug handled the first part of that meeting, Constitution approved, officer positions created, and then he presided over the election, and we had a slate of officers set and ready to go, and those stepped up and were elected. Don was the first historian. John Hussman was the first president. Doug was the first vice president and president-elect, so that he would step in the next year. So we have some continuity of people that had been working on setting things up and knew what they were doing and knew what we were all about. The committees were set up. I know Greg Rhodes was in charge of a rules and customs committee, very vital in doing the authenticity part of things and doing the research on rules, uniforms, language, all that. And as you know, then, Greg was head of the Sharon Village Shamrocks at the time, a very solid group. He then became the founding director of the Reds Museum and Hall of Fame, which is probably the best team Hall of Fame in all of Major League Baseball. So one of our stalwart members got all that going and all that. At that time, he morphed the Shamrocks into the 1869 Cincinnati Red Stockings team. So they adopted those uniforms and not only continued to play as a team, but also represent the Hall of Fame at the ballpark. They pose out there by that mosaic of the 69 team, and fans coming in could get their picture taken with them, and those kind of PR kind of things. So anyway, Greg was in charge of that, and certainly the right man to do that. Pat Massengale from the Colorado team, it was so nice that this started out kind of among our Midwestern teams that play each other all the time. As mentioned, Al Diekman came to represent the old Bethpage team, which had been up and running for a while. And then Massengale came all the way from Colorado. They had been at the Ohio Cup a year or two before that, and we had gone out there in '95. The Muffins had made a trip out there. So we knew them, so he came. So we had not only a kind of a parochial, Midwestern team, but we had East Coast and Far West and everybody invited, and everybody, welcome. So anyway, we got started. Massengale was supposed to do the kind of PR newsletter kind of stuff. And I know we're debating this as a group now. Where does all that belong? We had a committee to do that. He resigned very quickly, and I don't know all the background of that. But anyway, he wasn't with us very long on that. But fortunately, John Wells of the Muffin Group, who had been doing the Muffin 10 for several years, which had gone out to all the clubs. Everybody wanted to read that. It was kind of a de facto VBBA newsletter before the VBBA started. Many people wanted to be on our subscription list and get the copy of that all the time. Okay, so anyway, John took that over and started to turn out a very nice newsletter called Early Innings Illustrated with articles and just very well done. So anyway, I have a copy of that and I'll show that to you. But anyway, so I want to give you a timeline of how all that happened. And it took a lot of hard work, a lot of behind the scenes stuff. John and Doug working together to kind of make all these things happen, and for OHS to be the host. And in his remarks, when John was elected then and stepped up to the podium to take over as president of the group, he mentioned how similar it was to 1857, where the Knickerbockers, as kind of the senior club among the New York ones had called the meeting together to set up the NABBP, and the Muffins had hosted and called together the teams of that time to do roughly the same thing. So that was a memorable part of his speech. I had not thought of that before, but I thought, my golly, he's right, you know. So anyway, we had a good board. Ed was a trustee on that, as was your brother, I believe. I think he was on the first one. We have a couple photos there of the attendees of the meeting and the first board. So there we are. So I want to give you a timeline, rough idea. I know riding over here this morning, so with a couple of the Muppets, they said, well, now when did the VBA start? How did that get going and all that? So they got a little preview of what we're doing here today. But what an interesting story it is, and it took some real dedicated people to get it done. So with that, I'd like to ask Doug to say a few things, as he was really in the thick of this to get it going.
Thank you, Jim. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thanks. One thing I'm interested in, I hope you are too, and I think you can relate to it. Well, why did we form the VBBA? And it wasn't just us, obviously. We know in the mission statement it covers a lot of things that are very important as far as accuracy and rules and so on and so forth. But what I thought of was sort of the human element. Of course, the word community. We were people, as you are now, a small group, really. It's still a small group. I mean, it's fantastic. 27 states, perhaps 200 clubs in the association, but still small in the scale of things. We're doing a very unique activity, an unusual activity. It involved physical exercise. It involved mind stimulation. We were learning things. We were meeting new people. To me, it's sort of like a mathematical equation, which I'm not crazy about math. I like to pass history. But these things produced in us, as I think it does with you now, I'm sure it does, you wouldn't be here and you wouldn't be doing it, produced a joy. Hello, a feeling. We wanted to share that. It's natural the community starts small, whatever the community is. Grow the community. Share our joy. Share it with other people, spectators, form new clubs, help new clubs form. As I said, I think you know these feelings, and I think that was a big part of the joining. Ed, I'll ask Ed. Ed, what do you think of that? Is it too deep, or do we just want to play ball?
Well, I got to tell you, Doug, there are plenty of guys who would rather just play ball. It kind of went a little bit like this for me, maybe. Hey, Ed, what? You ever heard of this stuff before? What stuff? It's Casey at the bat like baseball. What are you talking about? Well, it's sort of like Civil War reenacting, but for sports fans. Well, where'd you see this? Oh, I get the newsletter from the Ohio Historical Society. You know, when I was in college at Ohio State, I had a membership. I went there to do research, and I get this newsletter, and they got this thing where guys go out, and they throw on funny-looking outfits, and they play baseball there at their old village. I've never heard of such a thing. What's that all about? Like, there was baseball before Babe Ruth? Ty Cobb? You know, this was a conversation I had with my twin brother. A lot of people in the room know I have a twin brother. We've met him before. He plays on and off with the Muffins, not as much as he used to. But I come from a town that has a canal boat. We've been running for 30 years or more. Actually pulled by horses up and down the old canal, right along the banks where we play baseball on our field. But We just launched the boat. This was the second boat that we had in town to replace the first wooden one, and there's a lot of history with the boats. So we're looking for something to pep that up a little bit. When Doug's talking about a feeling, you know, we started thinking about nostalgia, and you know, we've got the boat in town, shows how people worked. It's right there by these old buildings is where people worked and where they lived. And we have an old house, you know, and we've all been through that old house museum in some small town. It's got the old patchwork quilt, the old rope bed, and you know, and the settee over in the corner from the Victorian era. We all know that. Well, this baseball thing for us was interesting because we could show people how they show visitors how they spent their leisure time. This is another thing that you know, going into what Doug was saying, this demonstrating living history. In 1994, those words "living history" were a big deal. There was a convention in the Midwest. Maybe Bob remembers the name of it better than I do. Midwest
Open Air Museum.
Open Air Museum, yeah. And this were sites where they had the old buildings, and you'd have a blacksmith, and you'd have a craftsman's in all the buildings. And this is really where vintage baseball sort of got its start, from what we were all told at this first meeting and preceding meetings. The guys from New York were at this. The guys from Bethpage were there. They saw a demonstration somebody put on, and really nowhere close to what we know as the rules today. They were still finding stuff out. How many people here can imagine? I mean, I know we're all a little bit older, but how many of you can imagine vintage baseball before you had a computer to go to buy baseball bats, or somebody making the baseballs and you didn't have to do it yourself? That's where we were back then. I mean, I brought this as an example. This is a rag ball. The Incrediball was the brand. Indoor baseball, practice baseball. That's what we had when we started. The Muffins introduced my team, the Mules. You know, after this conversation I had with my brother, I contacted John Wells, who was in charge of the program at the time at the Ohio Historical Site. He said, well, we play a home game against you, and then you come down to our place and play a game at our place, and that way we get some games there at the Village. And, well, they showed us the game using these Incrediballs. And, okay, well, it was the closest thing they had, they thought, to baseball. And then J.R. Ferguson was another man who's from Kentucky, ended up working at the Kentucky Derby Museum as a conservator. He was a leather worker. He made, this is one of his baseballs. I see Doug brought a pristine one and sort of a game-used one or worn one. But this was the best leather baseball ever made in vintage baseball, and I don't care how many people make one after that, you're never going to make one like the one JR made. This saddle leather that he used, the number of stitches he put in it were all professionally done to a level that I don't think we'll see. I think the baseballs we see today, you know, and get into some commentary, that the consistency, the density, compression, whatever you want to call it, they're a lot different, but this was the epitome of a handmade vintage baseball. And you know, I welcome everybody to come up and take a look at it, or even here, pass it around. Yeah, pass it around, Mark, and show everybody. But we were making this stuff, you know, to put people in a frame of mind. We were making this stuff ourselves. We were sewing our own uniforms. There wasn't a uniform manufacturer to go to. My team made all the baseballs we played with. We had to find a guy in town who had a lathe to make the bats because nobody was making bats. Phoenix Bat Company didn't show up until probably 3 or 4 years after the association started. So our first practice when we were using this Incrediball, we were batting that around with a broken shovel handle, because that's how we learned the game. We put ourselves first in the mindset of what did they do then. We started out sort of with the caveman approach. They had axe handles, they had shovel handles, they whittled the wagon tongues. You know, some of the advertisements you see, the old advertisements, talk about the wagon tongue bats. Probably because it was the ash, it was the strongest material. They whittled it down, shaped it down for a batting implement. But I've kind of gotten beyond Doug's question about was it a visceral feeling that brought you to this, but what it was a love of history, and I think that's where a lot of people in this room came to it as well, where we were baseball a history curious, and then to see the game put on the field. I once heard this explanation, and it's probably evolved over the years from the truth. But Frederick Ivor Campbell was involved in the 19th Century Committee of SABRE, the Society for American Baseball Research, and Frederick was probably the premier researcher of that era of 19th century baseball. And a vintage game was put on at the SABRE convention, and Fred got to see the game laid out in front of his eyes. This thing that he had been combing through old books for years, and all of a sudden there were guys out there in the uniforms that looked right, using bats that looked right, playing on the diamond and underhand pitching, and it all sort of came together for him to see it. And they said he had kind of a Dr. Emmett Brown eureka moment where it was, there it is, it's the game. And I think that was sort of the eureka moment that some of us had when we saw the game for the first time. Whether you were a visitor that walked into the Ohio Village expecting to see, like I said before, the blacksmith, the old leather worker, go over to the hotel and see if Smitty's serving up those, basil shrubs or whatever they were serving there in the back room. But the living history part of it, I think, is what drew a lot of us to the game. And we lament sometimes the softballers and things that have filtered in, and with no disrespect, because a lot of those guys come to it and say, what you've created has put me in the mind to like baseball again, where I can get out of that mindset. Corny, I saw your hand
I didn't want to interrupt, but you brought up Mr. Ivor Campbell. I never met him,
Yeah.
but when I said that, the personal experience you're talking about, just for one little thing, I got to know Marjorie Adams so well, and what a gift she was to all of us in the game. But as she told me, he had a huge impact on awakening her and getting her really starting to go on the track where he actually said, Doc Adams saved baseball, and he was, I've heard about him, I never met him, but then we had Marjorie Adams, and he had a big part in that, and think what a gift she was.
Fred story at the Sabre convention in San Francisco in '98. We took a bunch of uniforms and just pulled in people. Some of us experienced vintage players and others that were Sabre members. And we had a vintage game at the Burlington Old Wooden Ballpark, a suburb of San Francisco. Fred Ivor Campbell was thrilled that he got to play that day. And somebody put him at third base. He said, I'm like Fred Waterman on the '69 Red Sox. And he just, you could just see that thrill in his, as somebody that knew the history of the game, and then he got to play it. And we are so lucky that we get to play it every weekend, pretty much,
Okay. Let me try one more. I'll pass it to Bill. I promise. And his brother Al was a big part of this, especially that research. I'm going to share two stories here because that's what I got. I got a lot of back in my day stories. For a guy my age, I sure talk like an old timer. But Jim's story right there is probably the story that I got and has been kind of evolved over the years, but that Ivor Campbell story. John Husband, who was one of the founding officers, as they mentioned, his middle initials R, and I found out later it was Richmond, and started putting things together, and we were at the Vintage Baseball Convention in Cleveland one year. We went out to Old League Park, where the field was. There was nothing left but a brick wall and a telephone pole about where home plate was. And John's name is John Richmond Husband, as they're telling us about the first guy who threw a perfect game in Major League Baseball. The guy's name was John Richmond. John Richmond was John Husband's great-grandfather, and was a doctor later in Toledo. And there was another guy, Harry Hyam, from the Atlantics we met. And Harry was the great-great-grandson of Dick Hyam, who played for, I think it was the Atlantics or one of the East Coast teams. So we had guys when we first started that literally had that connection to these players, and it made it real. And it's kind of things that kind of give you a little bit of shiver. I don't know that we get that message across like we used to. And John was a big part about getting a lot of guys involved with the Sabre in the early days, the 19th Century Committee, that got a lot of that historic knowledge into vintage baseball. But the last thing I'll share about John was he was the first guy to start talking about Doc Adams, and it was probably through Fred. And before Marjorie did, God bless you, Courtney, for bringing back the Knickerbocker experience. Husband had a Knickerbocker uniform made, the same reason you did. So what's old is new again. It's good to see this stuff coming back around. And John was also, as they mentioned about Rhodes being the historian for the Reds, John was the historian for the Toledo Mud Hens. So we had a lot of guys in the early days who had a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge, and we hope that we can continue this. And like I said, we could go on forever with all these stories, but we're going to let Bill talk here for a minute.
Yeah. If you look on your little packet there, there's some photos in the back, and Bill's brother, Al, is on the first executive council. He's in that photo there. So, Bill, representing the Cincinnati Red Stockings team. There we go.
Well, I didn't know I was going to be talking today, so I don't really have anything prepared, but I will tell you, I sure agree with Ed. And we were talking about this last night at dinner. My first experience with vintage baseball was a religious experience, man. I was never a historian or really wasn't that interested in history, but they put me in that old-time uniform, introduced me to the ball, introduced me to the game as it was being played at that time, and then we went out and did it. It was just awesome. I mean, and I was reliving history. And I became so fascinated with it, I started looking at the rules. I got on the computer and started looking at the rules. And if you start from 1845, reading the rules, 45, 50s, and then it was from 58 on, they changed them, or they looked at them every year. You see the game evolving. It is really fascinating. There never was a law until there was a need for a law. Same with the rules. There never was a rule until there was a need for a rule. So you see they changed the rule. Well, obviously somebody found a way to gain an advantage within the rules that was, I guess, supposed to be unfair. So they changed the rule. They made a rule. And you can just see, read it, do it. It's so much fun. To see how the game evolved just by reading the rules. And that's, again, I was never a historian, but I love that. So I've read the rules many, many times. And unfortunately, I'm the only member here of the VBBA Rules and Customs Committee. So if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them, or if I don't have the answer, I'll get you the answer.
I think Doug had a couple more things he wanted to chime in.
Well, that's nice of you. Although, if everybody's in agreement, I think we should go to if you have any questions, comments are very important. So let's throw it open to that. Anybody? Yes.
This might be off topic a little bit, but not much. How did the Ohio Cup originate?
The Cup?
Ohio Cup of Liberty weekend in
That's the right name.
Thanks. Oh, well, although I didn't, thanks. My first year with the Muffins was '92.
Okay.
Played with them for a while, then got on to Ohio Historical Society. The Muffins had had a team manager since about 1987. Briefly, the Muffins were founded in 1981. Some people, really, they're playing a regular schedule, you know. I mean, I'm not going to go on about this, but the Muffins were a big driving force, and they wanted to share the game. And, okay, the Ohio Cup was started in 1992. First competition. Then it went to a festival because people got too bent out of shape with the trophy and so forth, which that's understandable, right? I mean, so, and it's been going on ever since. So it was, the first teams were there, the Shamrocks were there, the Frogs, of course, two Kentucky Pioneers, they were out of Frankfurt.
The Laurels from Cincinnati.
The Muffins had 2 squads, as they continue to have.
The
Thanks.
Shamrocks. There was another team though, the Laurels, were one of the early teams too.
The Laurels, the Middletown Laurels were there in the early 90s. Teams come and go, you know that. Who else? Anybody question or comment?
Yeah, just sort of a general question of the group. Back when you were doing this in the mid-1990s, did you have any idea, or are you surprised by the way it evolved?
It's just kind of grown. No, we didn't know it would go from 4 teams to 30 teams. But it took a little time to do that. So now we just take that for granted. We'll have 30 teams there every year and some on a waiting list that would like to come, but we just don't have any more ball diamonds and play. We only have so much room to do it, right?
That's the Ohio Cup.
Yeah,
What about
that's what I'm saying.
The VBBA.
VBBA, I guess we hope this is exactly what it would be. That if we get the clubs together, that we all had these common questions, how to present the game to the public, where do you get the uniforms and the equipment, and how should we interpret those rules that are, yes, you can read those rule books, but boy, 6 people could read them and come down with 6 different ways to play the game, right? And we also, as authentic as we want to be in all these things, I would say, I was part of the committee that did the mission statement. And when we were thinking about that, we want to be as authentic as we can. Yeah, we were kind of thinking of wristwatches, sunglasses, white shoes with swooshes on them, that kind of stuff. And that first, before we get into the finer points of the rules, I guess I still say that when I see on our website or on Facebook, it's, well, welcome this new vintage team from so-and-so, and there's a picture of them, and they got, swooshy shoes, and their shirt tails out, and a hat on backwards, and sunglasses. Come on, we can do better than that. We may never agree on rules, and I'm pretty sure we won't, because it's been going on 27 years now, and we still have our differences. But we can all agree on that, on presenting the game that we look like a 19th century ball player. So I think, yeah. But I guess this is exactly what we hoped it would be, that we'd start out with these clubs. Fortunately, it wasn't just Ohio, or it wasn't just the Midwest. It was, West, East, and it's grown and grown and grown. So this is exactly what we wanted.
I want
What I think of quickly is there was a sense of optimism at that meeting. You know that, there was, because we figured it would grow, because it was, it's baseball at its root. And even then, more people grew up playing baseball and so forth. So it was an optimistic attitude, definitely. We've got some other questions.
I'll get Cordy here in a second. Jeff, hope you don't mind me calling you that.
Call me anything, not wait for dinner.
I love what we've got on the panel because we've got a lot of different viewpoints. Doug is the heartstrings of baseball. That's where Doug Smith comes from, the heart and spirit. Dr. Tootle, with his collegiate background, is a learned man of letters, and he's written books, and he comes from it from that respect. Bill Diekman is another guy that baseball is in his blood. It's in his heart. It gives you the shivers to talk to Bill about baseball. I'm anecdotal. I remember stories, remember things, and something that goes along with what you asked, Bob. I remember John Wells standing in front of us at the Historical Society in Sylvania, and he said, what do we want this thing to be? And specifically John Hussman, because he was into the early game, the Knickerbockers and the 57 and 60 rules. When we talked about, well, what about 1920s? What about all girls professional? We talked about that clear back at the beginning. What do we want this thing called so that we're inclusive? And John Hussman, I remember, and my brother and I joked about it a little bit, well, that would dilute my focus. We kind of used that as sort of a joke. But later, looking back on it, I understood what John meant about the more things that we do we throw into this. Bethpage was playing 1850s, 1860s, 1880s. They had 3 different groups going on at the same time. And so they had to accommodate all those different rules, where John was really focused on that early game, an 1860s game. He and Greg Rhodes at one of our conventions presented a document that said, let's adopt the 1860 rules of baseball as the Vintage Baseball Association standard rules. Didn't mean you couldn't play anything else, but it was the idea that if you got together with 2 clubs, that you could say, if we're gonna play 1860 one year, since then people have screwed that up and call it 60s with an S, and they think it includes a lot of different stuff, but John meant 1860 because we literally had reproductions of the Beatles guide from 1860. So it was the first document that we had back in that era, because no computers, no internet, whatever, that everybody could share around, and we were all playing by the same rules. One last thing, and we'll get to your question. The anecdote that I have along with that was the year before the convention started, there was a team from Columbus that had split off from the Muffins, and I mean no disrespect to them by saying they split off. They wanted to start their own club and do things their way because they had a difference of opinion, just like we still have difference of opinion with people. They were called the Haymakers, and they came to my place to play in Canal Fulton. And I took advantage of the rules, and I moved over to the side of the pitching line, 12 feet wide, right? I can pitch from anywhere on that line. And I threw a ball into the guy, and he made a weak grounder right in front of the plate. He picked it up and threw him out by a mile at home plate. He didn't even bother to run. He threw his bat down and says, that's exactly why we got to have a convention, why we got to get together and understand these rules. I was like, what? You're not even pitching from the plate. Why is there a plate there if you don't have to stand on the plate to pitch from it? Okay, so it was something like that that precipitated, from my point of view, along with what Jim has said, is that we had clubs all understanding the rules differently, even though they were spelled out in black and white together. So then when we got together, these things began to evolve and come to light, where we had these areas to work on. Some of them we're still working on today, as everybody knows, is sliding and stealing. Jeff, what was your question?
You know what? If I could, I got here and I didn't know what to expect, but where do you think?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, gentlemen. I came here in this class and I was curious because I had not been around in the early days, but to see what you guys have done, and I really loved what you started with, because that was perfect. I didn't know, okay, the VBBA just going to get together and show authenticity and we're going to do it the right way. Well, all right, fine. From the East Coast, you're from the Midwest, and there's been this little scrim back and forth at times.
Absolutely.
But I really like the spirit. I like the people. This is my 3rd conference. Last year was great at Greenfield Village. I got to talk about bats. Some of you might know about that. And talk about some other things. But why I want to do this, I kind of also promote something. As I was really listening, you start talking about how we're going to disagree with some of the rules at times. You start talking about the early days, what you guys struggle to do. You're sitting there, you don't have the bats, and you say, okay, well, we're going to try this. Well, what did they have? There was a struggle that you guys have all developed with and you evolved with, right? And so the continuing story is what you're doing from day to day. Tracy, all showing us all of the history. So the thing is, what I'm looking at, there are teams that we know, they're going to start off and you're going to look at some nice Nike swishes and some chains around their neck and some really cool sunglasses, like what's going on, and some things that really miss. Somebody that doesn't understand pitching the line, But maybe they're evolving, we hope so, we've evolved. But one thing I want to kind of show you is that with this Knickerbocker experience, and I kind of wanted to, all of a sudden I just thought about this as I was listening to you guys talk. The Knickerbocker experience uniform that I've tried to pull back, it's not a team. It's not my team. But what I've tried to do, first of all, the origin of this was because I was learning about baseball, had one of my best friends, Marjorie Adams, in the game, and talked to her so much. And when we were excited, thinking that Doc was gonna get into the game, I wanted to put an honorary a game that represented the Knickerbockers together. And with her permission, working back and forth, thinking it was gonna happen, I wanted to have the Excelsiors against the Knickerbockers, just like that famous 1857 photo, so recreate the uniforms and get it done. Got her blessing, started to work on that, and you know what happened. People said, what are you gonna do, Pine Tar? You know, I said, forget it, those idiots and everything, and I was kind of disgruntled, just gonna play the game. And he goes, but you put the uniform together, got people really going for, what are you gonna do? I said, you know what, I'm still gonna honor Doc, honor the early game, remember the roots of the game and all those Knickerbockers. Think about this, we've got all these great teams and there is no Knickerbocker team, which is probably great because now we can have this Knickerbocker experience. And why I really kind of wanna bring this up to you guys is that this is for everybody and anybody. Right now, players that have this uniform are from all over. So it's not a team, but if at Gettysburg you're there and you've got a full uniform and you can play, you are a Knickerbocker member. The biggest thing is that we're trying to come back to the real roots of the game, the core. When you play this game, it is totally voluntary. So, you know, you're trying to put a team together and they get desperate. They pull someone out of the stands, throw them in the field. With this, we're trying to do something very different. You need to have the full uniform to play. And you know, you're not going to have anybody to fill in. Even if I've started it, if I forgot my hat, I'm not going to be playing on the field because I'm not in full uniform. So that's the thing we're hoping to do. You guys could look at that. Everyone get the uniform, but then go back and study the early rules of 1858. You know, Doc Adams wrote the laws of baseball, and we'll play that. But this is something very unique. Even if you're kind of older, longer in the tooth, get the uniform with the historian and stuff and set this up, then that spirit will go back to your regular team that still might be evolving and struggling, but maybe we've got this centering with the Knickerbocker experience. And there are people in Minnesota, people, everybody else, all over the country that have the uniform and participate this way. So that's the call for that, because what you guys are doing, the spirit, I hope this helps.
There you go.
Thanks, Jeff. Bob, one last thing I'm gonna, and then I'll make sure we get some more questions. That other part of what John Wells said, when he said, what do we want this thing to be? He specifically compared us to Civil War reenacting. He said, we've got the blue jeans and BB gun guys who went out there when it first started, and we've got the guys who are stitch counters, who sleep in the mud and don't wear underwear. You know, that's really what, you know, it's funny, but we got to that point where what is vintage baseball going to end up being? And so you asked, did we see this coming? John Wells asked us to look for it coming because he had the foresight from his perspective of Civil War reenacting. He and his wife, and Rich Sherrick, and later Robin, his wife, the four of them were really involved in the medieval fairs and the creative anachronism groups and the costuming before cosplay and superheroes were popular. So they saw it coming and gave us sort of a good groundwork in those years to look for it. So, more questions?
I had a question for Jim. Tootle, what was your motivation for writing the Bible on vintage baseball?
Okay, thank you. That's not a plant, okay? Give me a chance to talk about it a little bit. The Muffins, over in the 90s, right after I got there weren't that many teams to play. And we went around to communities, we'd play a game with our extra uniforms, and then they'd say, oh, this is fun, we're gonna start our own team. Or we'd go to a historical society that wanted to start a team and put in a day with them, how to do it and everything. So, but it was all word of mouth. And we were doing it one group at a time, and I thought, you know, after we'd done that several times, why not write it all down as best we know how to do it, how to present the game, and where to get the uniforms, the bats and balls and all that stuff. But, you know, beyond that, this, what we've been talking about here today, this feeling, and this, it's different. As Doug, when he was team manager, always said, what we want to emphasize is what's different about this, not what's the same with big league baseball today, what's different. And it's the sportsmanship, the camaraderie, all that sort of thing. I would say that there's in authenticity, and I had this in the book, geez, Bill Helm emailed me several months ago and said, well, if you were doing your book again, what would you do different about it? Not much, because some of this stuff is pretty timeless. The Doc Adams part, 10 years ago, or 12 years ago now, we didn't know as much about him. And I regret that I don't have more about him in there. But we learned, it shows we're learning all the time. It's not, history is not something that's all learned, people are still learning new things. A couple things I want to say. VBBA has been inclusive from the beginning. We had a provision in the Constitution, in the bylaws, that there could only be 2 members from the same club, no more than 2 on the board at the same time. We wanted to spread it around, okay? The others that were there for sportsmanship and education. I know the Ohio Historical Connection, they don't care if we win 10-8 or lose 10-8. Did we present the game well? Did everybody, and did nobody got hurt? And I think we have to remember that as we think about rules. There's 2 things that if you represent a historical society or a museum, liability is on their minds all the time. We absolutely cannot let any of our spectators get hurt. And we want to make sure as best we can that none of us get hurt. It's upsetting to the children watching the game. We don't want the squad to come out and have to take somebody out. So, sliding, run into each other, we gotta watch it. Just let it go, let it go. Don't run into each other. So time of game is another thing. We've gotta keep our games about an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes. We can't have a 3 and 4 hour game. We see what that's done to big league baseball. So while we want to be as authentic as we can, we also have to think liability, time, cost. We all ought to wear wool uniforms like that. We can't afford those stuff, right? So there's things we have to accommodate for, okay? We can't wear metal spikes. We can't. So there's some things we have to do. So there's common sense in that. I guess if I could go back and write the mission statement again, I would say as authentic as we can and still not have liability and cost issues. I mean, common sense, common sense, okay. Anybody else?
And I think we're okay on time, but we're short on time.
Let's
'Cause
do
somebody
a
else is
lightning
gonna-
round, Doug.
It's cool because somebody else is gonna use this room, so any other questions?
Back here was
It's
nothing.
fine to have some questions.
Let's do a lightning round, see if we can ask them and answer them
This
fast.
guy's hand up here.
Here,
Yeah.
we'll do that table then up here.
In the face of teams that maybe don't have quite as good of an authentic look at as others, maybe not to the ideal standard, what as an association do you do in terms of sort of like either enforcement or just the effort to try to maintain that? How do you sort of get them, motivate them to kind of get on track?
All we've tried to do is be an example. From the beginning, we had that discussion, are we gonna be enforcement or are we gonna be education? And we took the track of the best we can do is educate, because no one wanted to sit on a committee that adjudicated forfeits and told teams they were kicked out. The thing was, if we would have kicked the team out, they would have continued doing what they were doing and they still would have had the same bad habits. So we decided that letting people stay in and just trying to stay with them and build their brand and help them out. Make contact with them. If you play a game with them, find a guy you can talk to and plant that seed in their head for them.
This fellow here, right here,
Who we got?
said,
Bill?
a couple of times, sir. I'm good now.
How about over here?
Y'all set?
You can go.
Who else has got a question?
Okay, I guess he's not gonna go. I'll go. I was just curious, we're talking about rules. I've been playing vintage now for close to 15, and I'm from Cincinnati, so we play by the fly rule. I'm curious, I know we got teams here from Columbus, Dayton, Connecticut. How does a team go about choosing if they want to play bound rule versus fly rule? Is there historical significance, or why is it that some teams adopt bound versus fly?
I'd say personal preference, really. A lot of
Yeah.
teams, when they get started, they find an old dusty picture in their historical society and say, gosh, I love that uniform, I want to put that on the field. So then they look at the years. We had 2 or 3 rule sets when we started. We didn't have 12 years worth of rules or continuous rules from 1857 all the way up through the 90s. So I think that has a lot to do with it. Tracy's got his hand up here.
As far as the bound rule versus the flag rule, did Greg Rhodes, did he say that they were playing at the same time, both at the same time? Greg Rhodes?
Yeah.
The Red Stockings?
Yeah.
They were.
Some
they were playing
matches,
both
some
at the same
matches
time.
were played, depending on where they went, they might play a bound or a fly game at the same time.
I
He's
thought
asking.
for sure I heard him say that. Maybe.
I don't believe they did in 1869, which is their famous year, of
Yeah.
course. They may have, I have heard that there were bound games played after 1864, and there were flag games played before 1864.
I sort of grabbed it.
Did he say we doing both?
Yes.
They were lobbying, some people were lobbying for the flag game back, I think, in the 50s.
And the bound game just gives you some more historical differences to show your audience.
And because we've gone, when Cincinnati we travel, we try to go by that home team's rules. But we've also had a discussion, like captains will talk, like, okay, we're playing 2 games that day, we'll play 1 fly, 1 bound. And you're right, the fans, we even have somebody like maybe who's our umpire of the day explain to the fans, in this era we play by the bound rule, and it's just nice for them to see the difference because there's bound, there's no
Absolutely,
stealing,
showing that
and then
difference
you
is
transition
important.
to the fly.
Eric, what do you?
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, I'm disagreeing with you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Eric,
why? Because it's good to play 2 games. You said bound
That's right.
rule and fly rule.
That's right.
Right, that's great to do that.
This
I said
should have been
that.
a double length
I said that.
session. This is like a good baseball game going into extra innings. Eric, what do you got?
Team I'm
Oh,
working
Tommy
with,
said
the West
disagree.
Coast Statesman, they, and this is kind of aimed at you, when I started, they were playing the bound game.
Okay.
And this was early last year.
Okay.
Halfway through the season, we want to switch to a flag game. I said, when do you want to start it? Tomorrow? I'm like, okay, because most of the team is 35 and younger. And they're like, it got boring. The bound game got boring for them, so they're playing the flag game now. But also, when I went in there, they, had the blue and white tennis shoes and the sunglasses.
This is,
and the Fitbits and all
This is
that.
what the convention used to be about. We used to have these good discussions all day long. And I don't want to put down anything that we do, but the ball game is sort of taking precedence over the good talks we used to have, and I miss this. And this is sort of what we were founded on, is sharing the information. I'll give the microphone across the table one more time. Thanks, guys.
We need to close up. Let me just say thank you all for coming and all that. Fly and bound, fly's a little harder to play. You need a little more athletic, younger players. And the games will take longer because it's harder to make an out. So you'll get into 2.5, 3 hour games. So, our historical society, I know, wants us to keep the game short. People will vote with their feet. If the game is taking forever, they will go find an ice cream or something, or the band, or something else. So you gotta keep your game moving along and not have a 3 and 4 hour game, I would say that, okay? Thank you. Oh, one more thing.
One real quick one too. We all have our variations. None of us play 100% authentic compared to the rules and customs of the day. That's not a big deal, and even us in the Rules and Customs Committee, who some are real sticklers about that. We can live with that. It's important though that we know what the rules said, and we know what the customs tell us, the history tells us. We have an obligation to the great game of baseball and to each other to at least know and be able to tell a spectator what really was happening, what the rules were. We owe that to the
That's very well put. We're around, let's have the discussions continue. Thanks for coming. Have a wonderful time with all of you, and we'll keep it going here. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Yeah, Jim, no problem. Yeah, we exchanged emails, and I see it's a cup, but you're bouncing from field to field with the cup. So yeah, we briefly talked last time. So yeah, that's the first time at a conference. So yeah, it's first time.
See you later in the year.
Yes, yes you will. We are